Wow, what an honour this is today. Today we are joined by broadcasting royalty. However, before we introduce him, we have two Spurs fans in here. Harry Hennings, Spurs fan number one. Welcome aboard. How are you feeling?
Very well, thank you. Yeah, great to be talking to you, Danny.
Yes, and Danny Kelly, welcome in.
Hello, chaps. It's brilliant. Really nice of you asked me to do this, and I'm looking forward to the next 3.5 hours of me banging on about how great I am. Yeah.
Well, of course, Danny, you're both a real inspiration to Harry and us. It's an absolute pleasure to be welcoming you on board.
Well,
the
that's
Bootroom
very
Podcast.
Nice of you to say, because it genuinely is very nice of you to say thank you.
No worries, no worries. So let's start the podcast then with your early days growing up. I mean, were you always interested in football, and how did you get into media?
Those are two very separate questions. Yeah, I was always interested in football. I grew up in a large Irish immigrant family in north central London, and football was always there, though it's almost hard for people of your age to imagine how distant the game seemed, because there was no live football on the television except for the FA Cup final, which was a huge event every year. The FA Cup in the 60s, when I would have been a little child, was as important as winning the league. It just was. And partly because of this enormous day on television of the FA Cup final, you'd see some highlights on a local television, a London Weekend in my case, on a program called The Big Match. Match of the Day then comes in. But we were very remote. You understood the football from the newspapers rather than the way it is now, 24/7 immersive activity. I guess the story that I always tell is that I was born and brought up in Islington about, I would say, 500 yards from the Arsenal Stadium. And my uncles, who seemed to be arriving on boats from Ireland at a rate of about 2 a year, they would take me to Spurs, take me to Arsenal. And even as a 9 or 10-year-old, I seem to sense that the one was the Foreign Office in red shirts and the other was strictly rock and roll. And so I chose to be a Spurs fan, despite everybody I have ever known, cared about or loved, including Mrs. Kelly, being Arsenal season ticket holders. I've had some regrets about this over the years. I suppose the worst was in 1971 when Arsenal won the double. They won the league at Spurs, one dreadful night. And it was May, and it was a roasting hot day. And I wondered what all my family were doing. And they were making replicas of the FA Cup and the League Championship trophies it was then, covering them in foil, cardboard replicas. They were going to the town hall to welcome Arsenal's team back. And I can remember standing in the garden. I was 13 years of age, and you could hear the roar of probably 500,000 people welcoming this goddamned Arsenal team back to the local town hall, which was 200 yards away. And I was alone in the baking sunshine listening to this. And I don't think even half a century of expensively assembled therapy has cured me of the feelings I had that day. So, yeah, I've always loved football. My dad was a very quiet Irish fella, loved it as well. And all my love of sport comes from him. And I can remember, and this is going to sound to you like it's I might as well talk about dinosaurs walking the earth. As a very small child, the 1964 Olympics were in Tokyo, and I remember lying on the bed with him. He had a red radio, and we were listening to the Tokyo Olympics, and a man called Baby Bikila won the marathon in his bare feet. He had no running shoes. He was Ethiopian. And I can remember my father explaining to me in his very deep voice why it was important that an African man had won an Olympic gold medal, why it's important that a black man had won an Olympic gold medal, the importance of the Olympics and all the rest of it. And I could, that being explained to you by your dad, who never explained anything else to me, but it stuck with me all these years. And it made me not realize, you couldn't realize, I was too young to realize, but it set in me a seed that sport is more than just first, second, third, that it has social context, that it has historical context, that it has meaning. And that's what I've loved about it over the years. As regards to your second part of that question, and feel free to jump in and prick this pomposity at any moment you feel. how to get into the media. It's a really, really bizarre story. I was working on the railways, like my dad. I worked at London Victoria. I had the worst job in Britain. Now, that is traditionally, that's been associated with the people whose job it is to remove the earwax at night from the members of the McVitie family in order to make the Jaffa cakes. But I had a worse job. I worked on the complaints counter at London Victoria, 24 hours a day, unarmed combat with the public. Not just because, of course, it's a continental term, not just the British public, but also foreign people shouting at me as well at the top of their voice. There was a union magazine. I was the shop steward for something called the TSSA, the Transport and Salaried Staffs Association, the white collar workers, ticket clerks, complaints clerks like myself. And after about, once a month you have to produce, and again, this dates this 8 Xeroxed pages. Look it up about creches and wage negotiations, and I got bored with it and started writing about music I'd heard, films I'd seen, and food I'd eaten. And long story short, at some kind of union conference, the now long dead but the greatest British jazz critic of all time, Richard Cook, saw this stuff and rang me and said, "I'm ringing you from New Musical Express," which was then the thing. "Are you a reader?" I said yes. I'm very excited. He asked me to do some reviews, and I became a music writer. And the rest of it is kind of odd, if you can talk, people, whatever. I'm trying to remember exactly how now. I think I started doing newspaper reviews on the old Radio 5 before it became Radio 5 Live. Serious newspaper reviews first thing in the morning. Met some people there who said, "What are you really interested in?" I said, football, music, etc. And bizarrely, I jumped from music into the media. From magazines into the media. It wasn't one lightning bolt where you say, "Here I am." It was a whole kind of hodgepodge of things that happened, and suddenly you find your voice on the radio, or your happy old head shining like a space hopper out of the television screen.
Was it strange to think that when obviously you mentioned that you were working kind of in combat with customers for transport, to think that then at 27 years old you would be writing for NME and then later becoming the editor?
The thought wouldn't have occurred to me. Of course, that's not how life works, is it? I mean, you chaps, Harry and Jamie, you're several laps behind me in life's race, and you'll find that people talk about sliding doors and stuff like that. It's just it can be a bit random. I got to be honest. And all I could say to you or to people listening who are perhaps at your end of it is, if an opportunity comes, try and grab it with both hands, and whatever talent you turn out you have. And there's whether it's bricklaying, broadcasting, or whatever it is you're good at, try and do the best you can with it, because there's no guarantee that just because you're clever at something that you'll be a success at it. There's so many other factors at play at any given time. Your personality, the hierarchies of organizations, inbuilt bias, depending on all kinds of things. I worked for years for the BBC, but there is definitely a class bias in there. There's no point in pretending otherwise. You find out that nearly everybody you meet has been to Oxbridge, and you have to, if not fight against that, you have to at least be very aware of it. There are all kinds of things that move things around. But the answer to your question, Harry, is of course I couldn't have imagined it.
Yeah, of course.
I had no idea what I wanted to do, really. Mostly I spent most of my time just wanting to enjoy myself. And so the idea of having a career path mapped out, I have to say, had never occurred to me. Now, the world is very different now. Young people don't have safety nets like Social Security as it was. Supplementary benefit. I remember talking to Mick Jones of The Clash about how important supplementary benefit was. It was a form of unemployment payment that you got, but if you said you were an artist, i.e. a musician, something, you got a little bit more, the supplementary benefit, and he's just telling, he's talking about how important that was for loads of musicians when they were starting out. They just had just enough money provided by the state to follow their dream. I mean, the thought of it now is almost where, bean counters and abacus manipulators run everything, where the cost of everything is known, but the value of anything is unknown. It just wouldn't happen. So, and I see people not your age, but 3 years older than you now. They don't have a career. They have a portfolio career. They do a bit here and a bit there and a bit there. I'm not sure it would have suited my personality, but no. The answer is, of course, I couldn't have imagined it. Why would you?
Yeah. Thank
Danny,
you.
I really want to ask you a question about sort of how broadcasting's changed. I know that you were doing stuff in the mid-90s, you were hosting Under the Moonlight and things like that. And I just wanted to know, has it changed in these last few years?
Of course, it's changed vastly. I mean, we are living through a time, all of us, where the new technologies, let's call them electronic technologies for the sake of a shorthand, the central characteristic of the new technologies is that they usher in the next technology quicker than ever before. So you have people who were born 120 years ago, and that they lived through the invention of the airplane, the telephone. The cliche.
Yeah.
That happened over the course of their lifetime.
Yeah.
You could, I had an internet business called 365. It's one of the first British internet businesses, and we thought that was like, where else can this possibly go? But now we see that everybody has the possibility to broadcast, whether that's social media, which is after all a tiny form of broadcast, to what we're doing now, where we're at different places in the world, and the technology. Some of the central stuff hasn't changed. You have a ball of information, news, and a ball of response, human experience and human responses, and you hit them at a certain angle to make either further news or entertainment. And having an ability to express that visually or in words in a way that's entertaining and engaging, all those things, that hasn't changed. But everything else has changed beyond recognition. The example I'll give from my own life is that I now broadcast on talkSPORT, Britain's biggest commercial station, from a hillside in Kilkenny. An experiment that started during COVID because they didn't want the quote fat old people getting ill. But the idea, on a Sunday night, I will be looking at my co-host Andy Brassell sat in his garden office in Newcastle while we talk to Tim Vickery, who's in South America, and we can all see each other, and people can respond to that and do respond to it in real time. I try not to look at my phone in real time because people are usually saying shut up, etc. It's completely changed. The other thing that's changed, obviously, is that when I was your age, the media landscape was 3 television channels, including Channel 4, and some very powerful newspapers, and an all-powerful BBC broadcasting. That has atomized. It has completely atomized. There are a million ways now to get your voice heard, to react to other people's voices and views. And because you've been born into it, say, you two, you don't realize how much it's changed, but it is utterly, utterly transformed. The central, I'll say it once again, the central spirit of what you have to do for people to want to pay you to do it hasn't changed. The ways in which you can do that and the ways in which people can respond and react to it have changed utterly and completely.
Obviously, myself and Jamie and everybody that we obviously share our course with, we're strongly interested and keen to get into talkSPORT and obviously things like that. But then I've also seen that you joined BT Sport in 2013 for football coverage, which is one of my biggest aspirations. So what's it like to obviously join a massive company like BT?
Look, Harry, the truth is, thank you for asking the question, but the truth is all my experiences are so off the wall and so unlikely, plus they put a layer of self-mythologization over that. Look, BT started, and Danny Baker and I were allowed to do about 2 years of completely unscripted television. It was extraordinary. We would go in there, and sometimes the shows were 2-3 hours long during the World Cups. without a script. For the first 6 weeks, Harry drove the crew insane because television is an industrial process and everyone feels they need to know what they're doing and where you're going to be in 30 seconds time and where you're going to be in 32 seconds time. And two old geezers shouting at the camera, making each other laugh, forcing Michael Owen to try and laugh, while all the time insisting that a stuffed dog would come in and out of shot randomly. And then we said randomly. It was amazing they gave us that chance, but it came about again because you just don't know, do you? Tim Lovejoy, who'd been doing the Sky coverage of in the morning on a Saturday morning for years and years and years, he and Helen Chamberlain had very kindly mentioned that some of their work. They came into to when I was working for the BBC. They came to BBC London and they had a DVD to promote of their show. What's it called again? Remind me what it's called, that Saturday morning show. It's still going, isn't it? Anyway, yeah. Helen Chamberlain and Tim were doing it when it was really good, and they sort of very apologetically said, "Sorry about this, because we know that half of this is nicked from what you do with Danny Baker," and that's okay. I said, I flatter myself that half of what I do is stolen from Howard Stern, so let's not get too prissy about it. But then suddenly, BT has infinite money to launch this TV station. When you went to their building, they had Gareth Bale, who was then, the most successful British footballer. He was sort of an ambassador for it. And the building had an entrance in which you could see up through the core of the building. It's a hollow in the middle. The poster of Gareth Bale must have been 150 feet high. It was extraordinary. Wow. But, of course, they asked Tim Lovejoy to come and help them with putting the programming together. And we were asked to do this thing. And so the feeling was, shall I be honest with you, Harry?
Yeah, go ahead.
By that stage, there was a kind of arrogance about Danny and I's work because we were winning awards left, right, and centre, and nobody else was doing the same thing. We kind of thought, well, of course they'd come and asked us. What else would they do? How else could they possibly launch this new television station without us?
Yeah, of course.
2 years later, when the reality of the amount of money they were spending on the actual football matches kicked in, I think they probably thought they'd better tidy up their roster, and that 2 hours of blokes playing crazy golf with frozen chickens was perhaps not what the viewers were looking for anymore. And more fool them, of course, more fool them.
I have to say, on the 12th of December 2016, the greatest ever show on talkSPORT was founded, Trans Europe Express. Could you talk to us? That's no problem. Could you talk to us about when you were just going from a presenter role to now having your own show, but calling it Trans Europe Express? Where did that name originate from?
Okay, this. I'm glad you asked me this. I've had lots of my own shows, of course, but we were putting together the idea of, for various reasons, we realised, particularly with the multiplication of TV channels, that they were going to have to fill this with something, and that the Italian, French, German football, etc., would become more popular. Also, of course, obviously, people were starting to play, FIFA and stuff on computers, and suddenly the world, the horizon for international football was widening, particularly with younger people, because they were, knowing these players through computer games. James Richardson's, Football Italia back in the day on Channel 4 was an inspiration. Though James, of course, when I told him all this, was completely bewildered and will not accept how influential that program was. But it really, really was. The name, it wasn't really initially. It wasn't called Trans Europe Express. Initially, it was called Danny Kelly's Eurovision. A joke about the song contest and all the rest of it, until one day talkSPORT got an actual cease and desist letter from your actual Eurovision claiming that we couldn't use the name. Now, quite how they thought that the astonishing globe-rogering success of a dance and singing competition could be mistaken for a bunch of blokes banging on about an Albanian left back in the middle of the night, I never understood. But being me, we had to cease and desist. And so now I come up with Trans-Europe Express in the hope almost that Kraftwerk would take exception, the people whose song it is, and they would stop as well. And I was hoping we'd get on a roll of being constantly legally challenged about the title. But of course, Kraftwerk, it turns out, are way too cool and just let it go.
Obviously, before you air your shows, how do you prepare for it, and how do you kind of stay informed in all the major European leagues? Is there certain sources that you rely on, or do you just kind of have a little look at everything? And
shall I be honest? I try and keep across it myself by watching bits and pieces of highlight shows, but the truth of that is that the preparation is mad.
Yeah.
And I don't mean BBC mad. When you're at the BBC, and you'll have 25 assistants, and the preparation will be going on for months for every single weekly show. talkSPORT is not like that. So we have an hour before the show, perhaps an hour and a half, since we've also gone visual these days, and you have to get the cameras and all that set up. So, and in that hour, I'm not going to lie to you, the producer, who is a football fanatic, and Andy Brassell usually, sometimes it's Kevin Hatchard, sometimes it's Lars Siversen, sometimes it's Daniele Fisichella, whoever it is, they pour information in. I say, what's happening in France? And they will pour information into me, and I will handwrite notes that later on you will hear me. I'm letting daylight in on magic here. You will later on hear me airily feeding back to them as my own knowledge. And the trick there is to not make it sound like you're reading something. It's incredibly intense, the preparation, but only for an hour. And it requires a set of learned skills, I guess, or perfected skills at being able to take on board that much information and regurgitate it at least 85% correctly. But people like Andy, the experts, they spend their whole life gathering up these stories. Now, of course, I don't do that part of it, but we also have some people in a WhatsApp group who will feed stories into us. The more obscure and funny, the better as well. And it is to my delight, actually, and great pride, if I might use that expression, that people who no longer work on the show still contribute to the WhatsApp group. They're so devoted to it. And I mean that. People who've got other important jobs, but have been over the last 9 years now, isn't it, who've been through the sort of the mill of Trans-Europe Express, still contribute. And they say, have you seen what's happening in Sweden? That's a bit like what happened in Turkey last year, isn't it? And these lines allow you to knit together. And what you're doing is knitting. It's a form of handicraft. You can knit together the almost infinite information about football that's emerging all the time. And, of course, the ever-changing event. Football's an incredibly easy thing to broadcast in one way because it changes every day. There's another match, another 10 matches, another 100 matches. Knitting those together informatively and entertaining is my job. You can't do it, though. It's a learned skill, but you can't do it without people feeding all the time into that kind of information mill.
What would you say your favourite league is then? Because I know that you talked about Turkey, South America, but there's so many obscure leagues, and I love learning about these obscure leagues. But for you to hear all this stuff, what is the best league?
Well, I think there's several that I'm really interested in. Turkey has an extraordinary football league in that the clubs are huge, and certainly the big clubs in and around Istanbul are huge. There's a mad, passionate support for it. It has leaked out because of the Turkish diaspora into huge supporters clubs in Germany and Britain and all the rest of it. The clubs are all mad there. They just, welcome to hell and all the rest of it. And when you talk to people who've played or managed there, in my case, Graham Souness, Les Ferdinand, people like that. When Les Ferdinand, he loves telling the story, when he first went to, someone check which Turkish club he was at, I can't remember now. And when they sacrificed a goat on the side of the pitch at the start of the game, I like Turkey because it's chaos. And of course, the good players go there because the way their taxation system works, the first 2 years a foreign person works in Turkey, you don't pay any tax. So that's why you see people going there for exactly 1 year and 364 days and say, oh no, I want to go back to Offenbach kickers now. Turkey's brilliant. look, all football leagues have their own characteristics. About 6.5, 7 years ago, I moved from London, where I grew up, back to the part of Ireland where my people are from. My mother's still alive over the valley. And the League of Ireland has come into my mind now. It's a completely unimposing league in many ways. It's terribly badly run, and has been. Irish football has been terribly badly run over the last 20 or 30 years even. But the football fans are the same. You go to a game in Dublin and you realise that the rivalries between Club X and Club Y are every bit as deep as those between Everton and Liverpool, even though soccer, as some people will call it here, languishes some way behind hurling, Gaelic football and rugby for public attention. But really, really brilliant things happen here in Ireland as well. My brother lives 100 miles north of here in a place called Bray in Wicklow, supports Bray Wanderers. They're great rivals. They wouldn't like to admit it, are another team called Cabinteely. 2 years ago, Cabinteely took over Bray. But this caused such a kerfuffle. One team, of course, Bray, a much bigger team, that now you have a club where the first team is called Bray Wanderers and the second team is called Cabinteely, completely different town further down the railway line, because they could not agree, like Inverness Caledonian Thistle, on a kind of portmanteau name. And you go to the games. I went to a game at Bray, last season. It's a summer season, so. And you're watching second division football in Ireland. There's a great intensity about the support. The game is of a certain standard. Who doesn't? I mean, if you love football, you just like going to the game. So I thought I'd go and buy a shirt afterwards, a Bray shirt, for a friend of mine who collects football shirts. But such is the weirdness of what's going on, I noticed that down to my right, there were perhaps 20 or 30 Spanish kids, 16 years of age. They all look pretty well heeled. And of course, I later learned they were at an international language school learning English in Ireland, because of the difficulty of doing it now in England because of Brexit and all the rest of it. They'd taken to coming to Ireland. So I go off at half-time, I traipse off, toddle down to get a cup of tea and to buy a Bray Wanderers shirt. I go into the club shop. There's not an item of clothing left. Not a shirt, not a short, not a sock, not a glove, not a cap. So what's happening here then? Do you not stock this up? She said, no, those Spanish kids came in at the start and just bought every single thing we had. They'd cleared them out like locusts. So I think it's really, Turkish football is the maddest. So I like that very much. My local football is fun. I like that very much. And then I like individual things, Jamie, where when Bodø Glimt suddenly become the biggest club in Norway or the most successful, and you realize they're inside the Arctic Circle. And I was speaking to someone who supports a family friend who lives in Oslo. And he says, you don't realize, do you, that because of the Mercator projection, it is, if we were to play AS Roma, if we were to play in Rome, it's nearer than going to Bodø Glimt. Even though we're in the same country, the distances involved are just gigantic. You can't see it on a map because of the way the world, believe it or not, the world is round, not very easily replicable on a 2D screen. He told me, Rome is nearer than Bodø Glimt, and I love that too. That people have to take a 2-day bus journey to get to a football match.
That's crazy.
Obviously, the Champions League is a competition that all big clubs, obviously, that's the one that you want to get into. But I suppose when you talk about, obviously, how you're interested in all the countries and and obviously about Bodø Glimt and Roma, is there sort of an aspect where you might prefer the Europa League? Because obviously, as Spurs fans, we've obviously seen Elfsborg and Galatasaray and teams like that. So are you more a fan of the lower European clubs?
You're heading in the right direction, Harry. I like the Europa Conference League now because there are clubs that even fanatics like me have never heard of, and you have to look them up. And you end up, and you look at, that's in a town in Czechia. And hang on, the population of that town here, it says it's 11,000. The stadium holds 25,000. So that's the equivalent of double the population of the town turning up. That's like 16 million people turning up to watch West Ham. You get into all of that. Look, the truth of the matter is that's all changed with time as well. When I was a kid, the going to Spurs. I remember a team called Keflavik turned up, their Icelandic team, and they got beat 16-0, I think, on aggregate. Those were the days when teams really were amateurish. They got applauded off the pitch, despite losing, I think, 9-0 in North London. The magic of that was not the result, but I'd never heard of Keflavik, and I would never see them again. I'd never hear of them again. Now, of course, with the technologies, if you want to decide that you're going to follow an obscure team in Albania, you can have the shirt sent to you almost instantaneously. You can have the program sent to you electronically. You can see the game online, legally or illegally. And everybody of your age knows every European football club inside out. That is a complete change to the way things used to be. I have enjoyed the conference, though, because it has churned up some clubs that even the most ardent players of Football Manager, FIFA, or whatever will go, who are they playing? And of course, it's an anomaly, isn't it? It was meant to be for clubs in smaller countries who finished fourth in their league to get some European experience. What they hadn't worked through was it meant that the seventh best team in England would be in it. So this year you've got Chelsea, who probably, could probably buy every other club in their qualification round, and just keep them as feeder clubs. West Ham won that tournament. The English club, near enough, should always win it because it's ludicrous. The 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th best clubs in England are still among the 20 biggest clubs in the world. Why wouldn't they sweep through the Conference League? I'll tell you what else has done, though. It has distorted football in certain countries. Shamrock Rovers this season they've got a qualification game coming up. They got to the qualifying rounds. They're the first Irish team, certainly from the Republic, ever to play football in Europe post-Christmas. They're a small, big club in Ireland, but small club in the world. Already, they have made over 8 million euros in their European journey. The entire prize money for the League of Ireland, for all the clubs involved, is 750,000. So they've made 10 times as much as the prize money for. So they can dominate Irish football for the next 15 years if they play their cards right, just from this one run in Europe. And those of us like Harry who are smart enough to support Spurs, we've had a recent knock-on of that.
Maybe.
St Patrick's Athletic here in Ireland have a very good young player called Mason Melia, and half the clubs in Europe were after him. Now he's signed for Spurs. But St Patrick's stuck out for a record fee ever for a player coming from the Republic of over €1.5 million. They did that because they knew there was a market for him, but also because they simply have to gather up as much money as they can to try and fight back against suddenly Shamrock Rovers having infinite resource by Irish standards. Then that's a mutation that's happened because of the Europa Conference League. This happened once before. Was it Rosenborg in Norway, who suddenly had a good team at the time when the Champions League started out, and they suddenly were bewilderingly dominant in that league. Now, of course, time people find ways to catch up, but it's fascinating the way the European tournaments have affected domestic competitions. You'll get plenty of people who will argue that the Champions League has destroyed the Premier League because the concentration, let's say Aston Villa is a good example. They strained every sinew and nerve and muscle, both sporting and financial, to get in the Champions League, a competition they're not going to win. And now it's affecting their form in the Premier League. So they have to strain every muscle again. And we saw what they did in the transfer window to try and replicate getting into a tournament where they're liable to fail. It's a very odd system, but it hasn't helped. I don't think Champions League has helped the Premier League very much, but of course it's a very interesting tournament once it gets to this stage. And tonight, the night we're recording this, when Real Madrid are playing Manchester City, that's when it gets tasty. Yeah.
I have to admit, there's this trophy called the Phoenix Trophy. And I think I was telling you about this yesterday, Harry. It's a semi-pro competition for it's a semi-pro competition, but it's for teams around the world that's semi-pro to play in Europe. But I suppose the Conference League's a bit more in the middle. It's for professional teams that are of a lower standard. So would you say that when the Conference League first got introduced, were you a bit skeptical of the idea?
Yes, I was, because I didn't really understand why. Of course, inevitably, we view these things through the prism of our own local football, and certainly the Premier League clubs didn't need another European competition to be qualifying for. But the basic idea that you would get clubs from countries who would never get into even the latter qualifying rounds of the Champions League and the Europa League would have something to play for seemed to me to have merit, as always, with FIFA and UEFA. One is really, really scared that they're going to make an absolute dog's dinner of it. But as it turned out, it's worked out really well. The only thing I would say, and I always say this, is the deciding, and I know that some reasons why you have to do this logistically, deciding where the final is going to be a year in advance is how you end up with Arsenal and Chelsea fans going to the far eastern part of the Silk Road for a UEFA Europa League final. I think that could be better organised. I get it. Like, for instance, in the Europa League this year, I suspect that Atletico Madrid have got a very good team, by the way, and will be really, really champing at a bit because the final's in their stadium. But I don't know how UEFA could do that differently, but I'm sure they could. But having fans travel, let's say, a Scottish team, to use an example, an Albanian team, end up in the final, and having to go to Azerbaijan doesn't make any sense. But that's a personal gripe. I think I had fears that it would be badly organised and what would come out of it. I think it's been brilliant, actually, truthfully.
Well,
Same
no,
with the Nations League. I mean, why do we need another international tournament? And yet the Nations League has worked out really, really well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And actually, whilst he's still staying on that same note of the distance, when Chelsea and Arsenal met in that Europa League final, I remember that Henrik Mkhitaryan, he couldn't travel with the Arsenal squad because of the conflict to do with Armenia and Azerbaijan, which I think is ridiculous considering Arsenal and Chelsea are two London clubs.
That's mad.
Yeah, but that's the complicated nature of global politics. And I wonder what would have happened if Arsenal had said, right, we're not coming then unless he's allowed to go.
Yeah.
Again, back in the day, I can remember when Celtic had a great team. They had a brilliant fullback called Danny McGrain, and they drew an Albanian team. They got to the border. Albanian was at that time perhaps the most communist country in Europe, but they looked for their example not to Russia but China, bizarrely. And Danny Beard had been banned in an attempt to suppress the Islamic religion. Beards had been banned in Albania. McGrain had way ahead of the current trend, had a big beard. And I remember Celtic being on the border for 2 days having to discuss this. And eventually the government in Albania had to back down because Celtic were a very big, powerful club, recently European champions. And just said, we're not coming without Danny, and he's not shaving his beard off. Check it out. Read the story. It's really bonkers. So the business with Mkhitaryan, nothing new under the sun, Harry. This stuff keeps on happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
For this season, it's a new season of the Champions League and Conference League and the Europa League format. And I know, Danny, you don't like this. You call it, well, you can tell us the name that you call it. But I know with the playoffs, it's a bit. Well, we would have thought that it'd be easier for teams to get into the Champions League. So obviously, it's bigger. But also for teams like City, for example, they've had an awful spell in the Champions League, but somehow they're still in the qualifiers.
Well, that's the purpose of it, isn't it? It was designed to take any last vestige of jeopardy away from the big clubs. From Juventus to Manchester, you know them ones, the clubs that fancy themselves in the Super League plus Spurs. The idea that they might go out of Europe at the group stage was just so abhorrent, so appalling to them that they decided that this is another way to go. Now, of course, partly it was two extra matches means more television revenue. There is far too much football now. Let's not kid ourselves. What you'd remove is another argument, but with the World Club Championship coming down the pipeline as well, it is not a coincidence that you've seen some of the most important players in the world, Rodri, who then becomes a living example, Son Heung-min, sitting at press conferences, not being asked, suddenly starting up about how much football they're being asked to play. There's far too much. The new European, the Champions League shape it looks like the Super League proposal, doesn't it, from 4 years ago? It does two things. It gives you more television dates, and it makes it very unlikely that one of the big clubs won't qualify for the latter stages. Of course, the gods of football have gone, well, we'll show them. And so tonight you get Manchester City and Real Madrid, I guess the two most dominant teams of the last 5 years. One of them has to go out of the tournament. And that's a valuable lesson to organisers. You can't just make everything work for the big clubs. But they've been lucky in one way, in that we got to the last day of the qualifiers, that mad night when there were 18 games simultaneously to try and follow on TV or radio, whatever your chosen medium was, with virtually every club still having something to play for. Because trust me, in years to come, when teams have worked out how many points you need to get and play their full team in every game in the first 5 games, there's going to be a lot of dead rubbers further down the line. However, it was very exciting on that last night. You've got to call it as you see it. And these playoffs, as I say, particularly because the draw was cruel enough to bring us Real Madrid against Manchester City, it's just too delicious, isn't it? Now, as a person with no skin in that game, it's delicious because of the quality of the football we might get, and also one of these big clubs is going to fall on its face. Who doesn't love that?
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, we're going to have to come on to it at some point. Tottenham Hotspur. So, Ange Postecoglou, what do you think of him? Because I think I've never wanted to work out with a manager more than Ange. But obviously, we've seen this season.
How's that going for you, Harry?
Yeah, not so great at the moment, unfortunately, is it? But no, look, last season we saw up until that 4-1 defeat at home to Chelsea that the style of football was absolutely working. Obviously, we were unbeaten in the league. Come October time, we were still top, and I think we were 4 or 5 points clear. When we've got the players and obviously not any injuries, do you think Ange's philosophy works perfectly for us?
First of all, the upside, having had 3 defensive managers, one after the other. And I don't just mean tactically defensive. In the case of Conte and Mourinho, personally defensive as well. It was driving me mad. The DNA of the club, whatever about winning trophies, people say, Spurs haven't won a trophy for 17 years. Well, my answer to that is Arsenal in that time have won 1 trophy. So it's that suddenly make them so much superior. They've won 1 FA Cup. They're a better team than Spurs at the moment, but these things are temporary. I was glad that we got a manager who was intent on attacking. And of course, I enjoyed those first 10 games where Spurs were doing some things differently from other Premier League clubs. The very, very high line, both the fullbacks inverting rather than just one, which had been the tradition. He didn't invent that. Everyone was doing it and still do. The problems came with that game at Chelsea, where we had 9 men, 2 red cards, continued to play the high line and lost 4-1. 2 things happened. The team was applauded off the pitch by the people who were in the stadium because of their fighting spirit to try and do that. I thought it was nuts. They could have protected their point with 9 at the back, as Liverpool did almost successfully at the very same stadium a few weeks later. And certainly when Ange came out and said, and it was flippant, "That's what we are, mate." Was that the exact phrase?
It's just who we are, mate. Yeah.
Just who we are, mate. My blood froze because every coach in England just went, okay, so that's what Tottenham are going to do. And we know there's no surprises. We can just face it down. And the truth is, Harry, that even allowing for the injuries, which have been extraordinary, but every club gets some injuries, the results since that Chelsea game and his statement that's how we're going to play are terrible. And the points per game is terrible. And we are kind of lucky this season that there is some dross at the bottom of the Premier League. Otherwise, we would genuinely be worrying about relegation. My worry is, look, I'm a great admirer of football revolutionaries, people who come in, do something tactically that you've not seen before, and that puts everyone else on the back foot, from total football onwards, but football coaches are paid hundreds of thousands of pounds a week now to find solutions to these revolutionary breakthroughs. And I've got to say, and it's all about levels because it definitely worked in Scotland, but there he had, I suppose, 20 of the 25 best players in the country were all playing in one club. In the Premier League, if all-out attack people running extraordinary distances was going to consistently and, sustainably work, why wasn't someone else doing it?
Yeah,
The problem at Spurs, Harry, long term, is that the people who own it and run it, and we're helpless bystanders in that process, they think they're geniuses because they got that club with that wage structure to a Champions League final 5 years ago. What they don't realise is they lucked in. They lucked into a generational talent of Harry Kane. They lucked into a £5 million deal for Dele Alli, and they lucked into getting a back four. Of course, it was Trippier in that final, but Walker, Alderweireld, Vertonghen and Rose, and the goalkeeper, World Cup winning goalkeeper, cost them what would now cost you one decent young player about 50 million quid. They think they were genius for doing that. It was luck. And the problem with successful businessmen is they think that what they do, which often requires a great deal of luck, if it's successful once, then that is the formula. And they are sticking to it, underpaying for players, underpaying the wages. And to some extent, and this is not Ange Postecoglou's fault, we're seeing the long-term fallout from that, because the answer, Son being the exception who was in that team, if you look at how the recruitment has gone with Liverpool and Spurs, who were playing in that Champions League final 5 years ago, Liverpool have improved in almost every position, except the two that you couldn't improve, Van Dijk and, the Egyptian king. Spurs have not got one player who's better than the players they had that day. And that is a terrible indictment on the club, Harry. Now, look, you're still a child, right? In my eyes, you're a child. I'm sure you're an absolutely grown-up person, voting, joining the army and all the rest. You're probably married 3 times for all I know. But it's easy for me going on about trophies, isn't it? Because I've seen Spurs win the majority of their trophies they've won with my own eyes. So maybe my desire for that is sated. And I do think about younger Spurs fans and how it would help them if they got themselves over the line just this once. But, since Spurs last won a trophy, Wigan have. Does that make Wigan a better club? No, it doesn't.
No.
But I do understand that people like you are on the sharp end of banter, as it gets called, hashtag banter, 24 hours a day. Sometimes, though, when all it seems lost, just stick your chest out, say, I support King Spurs. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Harry, I've got to say,
they're a great club. They're a great club, Harry. Don't let
it's actually a roller coaster watching us, yeah.
Yeah. Roller coasters go up and down, I think you'll find.
Yeah.
Harry, it doesn't help though that all the other lads in the boot room are not Spurs fans, does it? What we got? We got Liverpool, we got Chelsea.
Yeah.
Is that it, right? Liverpool and Chelsea.
Yeah, and Spurs, yeah, exactly.
That's crazy. So it doesn't help.
On the huge and multi-award-winning podcast I do about Spurs, there's only 2 of us who are Spurs fans. The others support other clubs. But that's part of its unique appeal, the view from the lane. You get a kind of 2 things. You get a much more balanced view of what's happening at Spurs than if you just had a load of Spurs fans crying and shouting and gnashing and weeping. Plus, it allows those people to talk myself and James Moore down off ledges after particularly awful defeats. James is a naturally gloomy personality and he has to be talked down off the ledge. My response to Spurs, say, losing the way they did at Liverpool the other day would be to go to the stadium and set fire to it. So I'm talked out of those things by more sane personalities.
Danny, do you think that Ange Postecoglou, firstly, is in the wrong, but secondly, I find it crazy that they're even thinking about sacking him? I know this season's not gone to plan, but do you think he'll keep his job by the end of the season?
No, I don't.
Really?
Because results are results, aren't they?
Yeah.
There is, there are injuries. There are players falling out with the manager. Every club has vicissitudes. I'll use that word in everyday conversation. They have ups and downs. But at the end of the day, people will just, cliche, the results are just terrible. And also, I know the players are tired now because Porro, I think, has played more minutes than any other outfield player in the Premier League this season, and looks like he's forgotten how to play. I just don't. It'll be 2 years at the end of the season, and are the players better than they were 2 years ago? No. Is the team better than it was 2 years ago? Evidently not. Definitely. And Antonio Conte was sacked after a rant at Southampton, where, but for a ridiculous penalty decision, Spurs would have gone third. He was sacked. So they have sacked high-profile and moany managers when one of them was in a cup final, another one was going third in the league. They have sacked club legends, Ardiles, Hoddle, etc., for a lot less than what's going on there now. I feel terribly sorry for him about. It's not just that they've got injuries. Bournemouth have got a lot of injuries, but they've got the wrong players injured. The recent game against Aston Villa, the transfer fees paid for the players who were injured was greater than those that were available to him, both on the pitch and on the bench combined. A lot of that's a lot of talent to miss out of a team. I'm sorry that it's gone so bad. You know, whether the running that's demanded of them in training and on the pitch is part of the injury crisis, I couldn't say. I'm not medically qualified to say that, but I would have liked to have seen the experiment continue with a fully fit squad to see what would have happened. Though I genuinely think that even after the Chelsea game, people started to work, well, this is what they're going to do. And they've learned to close down the middle. They've learned all kinds of things. That's what opposition coaches are paid to do. I don't know where they'll turn to next. So they've tried superstar managers. They tried revolutionaries, inverted commas. I don't know where they'll go next. What do you think, Harry? Do you think he'll survive?
I think he will, and I don't know at this moment in time, but I think, was it 3 weeks ago? There was a club statement, not an official one, but they were saying that the board kind of understood the situation that Ange was in, and they understood all the injuries he had, and they knew he was obviously trying to make the most out of it. So I think they did have some leniency for him, and I'm really hoping that they continue to, because I do love Ange. I mean, I really, really hope it works out. And he said the other day, actually, I speak to Chris Cowling quite a lot, the Spurs podcaster. Mm-hmm. And he was saying how Ange said that once we get our injuries back, we'll be an outstanding team, which, again, it might be a bit of a bold statement, but he's not afraid of making these bold statements, is he? So there's a lot to digest, really. But something else I wanted to mention was I've noticed by Twitter that your admiration for Radu Dragusin, and I completely agree. I think it was a few weeks ago you were saying how it was a shame with his injury. He always gives 101%. So if Romero was... No, go on, sorry.
No, Dragusin was one of those players who was forced to play perhaps more than he would have been expected to, although not by his agent, who thinks he's, Franco Baresi.
He does.
Dragusin played after he had a virus. He kept playing when he was ill. He went back on the pitch with what it turned out to be a terrible injury to his ACL. So what I was saying, Harry, is that whatever his shortcomings as a player, and I actually think he's a player who's much better when Spurs are under pressure. He's a siege defender. He doesn't look so good when Spurs have the ball. And you can see other teams channeling their press to make sure that he's the one who has the first pass out. In a way that Romero is brilliant at passing the ball out. Radu is not quite so good. Now, my point was simply that, and in some ways it's irrelevant, because I would expect maximum effort from everybody. That's the minimum requirement of a professional athlete. But he really has gone right to the edge, if not beyond the call of duty during his time in the team. You know, has he made mistakes? Of course he has. Has he played with his heart? Yes, he has. And that goes a long way with me.
I have to say, there's one player that I absolutely admire by the name of Nathaniel Phillips, obviously Liverpool centre-back. But we're not going to get into him, but I think those players that give you what you need in those bad situations are those players that really step up. In terms of the managerial situation then, obviously Ange is rumoured to leave, and obviously Ryan Mason is there somewhat. Do you think, it shouldn't happen, but do you think Ryan Mason is going to be considered for interim at least?
Well, history tells you that he will be. Yes, he's fast becoming the David Pleat of the 21st century, isn't he? I think the other fellow, Wells, is also being considered for the interim. He's highly regarded as the coach there. He's got Spurs DNA. His grandfather is Cliff Jones, who was in the double team of 1961. But the truth is, Jamie and Harry, you're talking to me as though I have some insider knowledge of this. I have no connection with Spurs as a club, except, having poured my blood, sweat, tears, emotion and money into it for over half a century. I make a point of not trying to be an insider because that's not the way my work works. And also, football clubs, I don't envy my colleagues on The Athletic who have to try and probe every day for nuances of news here and there, because football clubs are extraordinary institutions in that I believe that there is more attention paid to them than any other human activity that's legal on the internet. And yet you shine the brightest of lights on them 24 hours a day and they send back nothing, a kind of sullen, dark silence. And I mean, sure, Harry knows this too. Spurs have been in crisis for 2.5 months now. We've not heard a peep from the owner, no surprise, but also from the phalanx of people with fancy titles: director of football, sporting director, director of football sports, sport director football, brackets. There's dozens of them over there, all earning, I'm sure, a pretty handy stipend. Not a peep out of any of them to support the manager or to explain to us what's going on. For instance, I said on the View from the Lane the other day, if Postecoglou was allowed to come out and say, right, this is all turned into a bit of a dog's dinner, but with the players coming back, we can still qualify for the Champions League via winning the Europa League. And therefore, I'm going to prioritise the Europa League, and we're going to finish 15th because I'm going to play half and half teams in the Premier League. I would be so much more comforted because it would seem to me there was a plan which was explicable and the result of which was measurable. Instead, we have a nebulous stream of nothing and the manager being very defensive with journalists. I can't think of another business on earth that runs like football does. And, as I say, that you can pour so much interest into it while getting nothing but a blank 1,000-yard stare back from the general direction of the. It's not just Spurs. Most of the clubs do it.
Yeah. Obviously, if worse comes to worse and Ange is he either is sacked or he decides to mutually part ways, do you think we need to bring someone in with Premier League experience like Thomas Frank, Iriola, who we've been linked with? Or obviously, I did see heavy links and rumours to Edin Terzic, the old Dortmund manager, but there were obviously rumours there that Spurs fans didn't want him, to put it simply. They were more interested in having a Thomas Frank or a Iriola at the club.
I don't know, Harry. If you asked me right now, I'd probably go for Fagioli or whatever the man's name. I hope I pronounced it correctly at Ajax, who is a pupil of De Zerbi, and therefore, very interested in attacking football. Or someone like Sebastian Hoeneß, who's doing an amazing job at Stuttgart with great commitment to attacking football, but not forgetting that there is a goal at both ends of the pitch and defending that. Although he only has to have half a good season and he'll be the next Bayern Munich manager because his uncle is Uli Hoeneß, who virtually runs Bayern Munich. There are people out there without Premier League experience. And truthfully, and here's the difficult thing, where are the clubs currently managed by managers who have previous Premier League experience? Where are they in the league? West Ham have Potter, bottom half. Eddie Howe doing okay at Newcastle. By and large, people's second job in the Premier League doesn't guarantee you, or third job in the Premier doesn't guarantee you success. So I think I get it. I totally understand the argument for Iriola. I totally understand the argument for Thomas Frank. And what they're hoping to do is to replicate the springboard that Pochettino brought when he did his year at Southampton. But I think the game is global now. I think they should be looking at all the big leagues to try and find a manager who matches the club's attacking DNA, who is looking to improve their own career, even if that means using Spurs as a stepping stone to go and be the Real Madrid manager. And also, I think the appointment of managers is one of the great mysteries of life. Who knows what's going to succeed? Ruben Amorim was my choice when they went for Postecoglou because of what he was doing in Portugal. He walks into Manchester United and now he looks like Sideshow Bob in that scene from The Simpsons where he keeps stepping on the rakes in the garden and the handles hit him in the face. That part I don't envy the club. It's a difficult job, but it's the one they're all hugely paid to do correctly. So we'll see what happens.
And last one for me, Danny, can we win the Europa League this season?
There are better teams than Spurs in that Europa League. Trust me. The fact that they're co-favourites of Manchester United. Can you hear the laughter from continental Europe that these two English basket cases, as they currently are favourites? That, of course, just reflects, I think, the betting power of English punters. My guess is that Atletico Madrid will really go a long way in this tournament. Now, unfortunately for them, in a weird way, they've suddenly found themselves, because Bayern Munich, Barcelona, Atletico Madrid keep stumbling, they found themselves on the edge of the title race in Spain, which they probably weren't expecting.
Mm-hmm.
But they've got some great players. The game is in their home stadium. That's my prediction, Harry. If whoever beats Atletico Madrid in this tournament will win it. I can't be more plain than that.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
And
sorry,
Danny,
I say Bilbao. Sorry, I'm losing
Yeah,
my mind.
I was
Bilbao.
going to say Bilbao. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Athletic Bilbao. You're asking me. I'm going through my Rolodex there, and I got to Athletic. Yeah, Bilbao, of course. Yeah,
Perfect.
actually, Atletico Madrid might win the Champions League. That's also true.
Could do.
Yeah,
Danny, we always end it on the boot room with what would you give advice to? So the younger guys coming through, some Harry and I, and then everyone behind the scenes of the boot room. What would you give them advice for? Because obviously you've been working in the industry for years and years and years. So for us coming through, what would you say?
Let me try and say something that's achievable. I guess my advice would be to maximize opportunity. If you get an opportunity and it looks a bit small or a bit difficult, do it. Because you never know who's watching, you never know who's listening, you never know who's the person who's sitting on the desk opposite you, who might be a boring bloke or a boring gal drinking their tea. 2 weeks later, they could be the head of BBC. You don't know. And so try and make an impression on people. The truth of the matter is it's very difficult because the pathways into the media appear to be so nebulous. It's not like being a doctor where you train for 7 years and then the jobs are advertised in the Lancet. It's much more difficult than that and different. But with the new technologies, newish technologies, there is a million ways to make yourself visible and heard out there. And even if no one is answering your CV and emails, make something that goes on YouTube or on X or on Bluesky. Let people see and hear what you can do. As I say, once you get an opportunity, however small it may seem to you, I would grab that. And this is a terrible thing to say from someone at my end of this. Work hard, because there'd be people out there with less talent than you who are working harder. Daley Thompson, twice Olympic decathlon champion, famously used to train on Christmas Day because he says, I would get the extra day's training knowing that the others would all be eating Christmas pudding. So that was 2 days training that I was ahead of them already. What I'm trying to say is, I think when I say work hard, I don't mean you have to be a coal miner, but once you get an opportunity, concentrate on making the best of yourself in that space. It may not work, but I can't think of very many examples of people I've met over half a century in the media who haven't tried their very best to be the best of what they are. They may have failed, but very few people, every one of us, me included, gives the impression, it's I come on, I just do my thing. That's a lie. That is a massive lie. Everybody thinks about it carefully. Even when I was doing unscripted television on BT, we knew what we wanted it to look like and be like in our minds and focused everything on getting that kind of fizz and energy through the difficult thing of a TV screen. And you'll fail. Things will happen and you will fail. But if you've given it your best and used your talent to its utmost, then you can fail with honor and you won't always fail.
Well, Harry, firstly, before we say goodbye to our guest, well done for the first interview. Congratulations on that.
Very good, Harry. Very good.
Thank you very much, Danny.
And great quiff, by the way, as well. Absolutely magnificent. Yeah. Better than Jamie's, isn't it? Better than Jamie's. Let's be honest. Let's be honest.
It probably is. No, you're right, Danny. You
and
are right.
Certainly better than mine.
Thank you very much.
Hey,
Thank
Danny,
you.
we really appreciate you coming on today. Thank you so much.
No, I've really enjoyed it. Good luck with editing that nonsense and whatever you do in the future. Bless you both, and also anyone in the unlikely event that anyone's listening. Bless you all for asking me. I've enjoyed it. Cheers now.
Thank you, Danny, very much.